Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue our discussion with mental illnesses in fiction. And today we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. In our previous video we talked about trauma, and that was in preparation so we can talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. Or PTSD is what most people call it. But if you remember from the last video, trauma is basically something that happened to you in the past, something that happened to someone in the past that still has a negative impact into their future, or I think maybe even just an impact in general. When we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, we are talking about specifically negative impacts. I think if you remember right, I used the example of three different people who all went through the same combat situation. One's life was destroyed, one's life was turned around and transformed, he became a better person, and another person just sort of didn't forget. That person's life who was destroyed, that he would be suffering what we call PTSD. And it's a very complex idea, and it's been around for a long time. We just haven't called it that in a very long time. George Carlin has a great skit. If I can find it, I'll put it in the link below, or maybe I'll even put it in the video right here. We'll see.
There's a condition in combat, most people know about it. It's when a fighting person's nervous system has been stressed to its absolute peak and maximum, can't take any more input. The nervous system has either snapped or is about to snap. In the First World War, that condition was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language, 2 syllables, shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was 70 years ago. Then a whole generation went by, and the Second World War came along, and the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. Then we had the war in Korea, 1950. Madison Avenue was riding high by that time, and the very same combat condition was called operational exhaustion. Hey, we're up to 8 syllables now. And the humanity has been squeezed completely out of the phrase. It's totally sterile now. Operational exhaustion. Sounds like something that might happen to your car. Then, of course, came the war in Vietnam, which has only been over for about 16 or 17 years. And thanks to the lies and deceit surrounding that war, I guess it's no surprise that the very same condition was called post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen. And the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet you if we'd have still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have gotten the attention they needed at the time. I'll bet you that. I'll bet you that.
He talks about how we use language, and again, because this is a writing channel, I think it's kind of important to pay attention to this, is that in World War I, we called this exact same concept shell shock. And he talks about like shell shock, even sounds like the thing. And these guys who were so overwhelmed by the combat that basically their nervous system was just shut down. It just was just overwhelmed. They just couldn't handle it anymore. That level of stress and fear and that sort of thing. The human body is meant to handle really a lot of stress and a lot of fear, but in very short bursts. Being attacked by someone and fighting them off, that's something our ancestors used to do all the time. We were either the attackers or the attackees, whether it was an animal or another human, and we could fight that off, and then we'd move on with our lives. But especially in like a combat situation, or maybe a domestic violence situation, or where there's child abuse, chronic abuse in the home, that's not something that the human body is really meant to handle. We're not really equipped to handle that. And George Carlin talks about how in World War I we call it shell shock. It sounded kind of like what it was just these constant barrage and that sort of thing would just overwhelm people's feelings. And then in World War II we called it battle fatigue. Sound like you were just kind of tired, like you just need a nap and you'd be okay. I think in Korean War he said we called it operational exhaustion, which don't even know what that means. So what's the operation and who's exhausted and that sort of thing. And then we switched it to post-traumatic stress disorder sometime around in the 80s or so. I do disagree with George Carlin a little bit because it's not just about combat. That was something that we discovered kind of in the 80s, is that I think it was with women in domestic violence situations specifically, that they showed a lot of the exact same symptoms of a combat veteran. And so we kind of expanded that that idea from post-traumatic stress disorder from just being about combat to really being about almost anything. Like I said, any traumatic event that has negative impacts in the future. And so PTSD is a lot more common than we used to think. And I think one of the hard parts, this is from a clinical standpoint, is the symptoms are very vague. Let's see, what are some of the symptoms of PTSD? See if I can remember off the top of my head. Hypervigilance is a big one. These are the people who are constantly worried about something, and they don't always even know what. The military, I like to say, they have their head on a swivel because their head is constantly looking around for the next threat. They are triggered. When we talk about triggers, this is actually what we're talking about, is trigger warnings, meaning this might trigger your PTSD. It doesn't mean you might hear something you don't like. It means this can cause flashbacks and this sort of thing. Like common trigger warnings, again, for military is fireworks. A lot of veterans don't like 4th of July. They don't like New Year's because the fireworks remind them of firefights. Little known fact, but for a long time, I don't know if it's still the case, but the U.S. military leads the world in night vision technology. And so that gives us an edge over the enemy, that we can see them at night and they can't see us. And so a lot of military operations happen at night because that gives us the advantage. Well, if you've ever seen like guns going off or explosions or whatever through night vision goggles, it looks like fireworks going off in the night. I heard of one guy who was terrified of driving because, and this was, I think, in Iraq, he was always, in Iraq, he was always afraid that someone would pull up a car next to his vehicle and then explode it. And so just being stuck in traffic in the city was a trigger, that sort of thing. Sexual assault violence, victims of sexual assault, they just touching them in a certain way can be, and it doesn't have to be sexual, just, but touching them in a certain way can kind of trigger these sort of things. So that's that sort of hypervigilance and this sort of easily triggered, I forget what the actual DSM word is. You can also have nightmares, dreams, intrusive thoughts, people constantly thinking about the thing, thinking about their abuser finding them again, thinking about another criminal situation, worried about driving, whatever the trauma was. What's another one? Dissociative, the flashbacks, quote unquote flashbacks. Dissociative episodes where they're awake, they're not asleep, but their mind is now gone. They're now back to whenever that thing was. However that happened or whatever the thing was, they're kind of gone. And I've seen a few people with flashbacks. You can tell by the look in their eyes, they're not seeing what's in front of them anymore. Their eyes are looking inward, back at whatever it is, and so pulling them back in to getting them grounded again is very useful. But the problem from a clinician standpoint is almost all of those can be explained through something else. Lots of people have nightmares. Dissociative episodes can look like psychotic episodes. That could be, schizophrenia or some other sort of episode like that. Even the triggers could just, be explained by phobias or something else along those lines. Hypervigilance is just a generalized anxiety disorder. It's not really related to anything else. Drugs and alcohol and psychedelics can all mimic some of these things. So PTSD only makes sense in the context of knowing a trauma. And as a clinician, I don't always know that my clients have been traumatized. I primarily work with male clients, and I've been in private practice for about 11 years or so. I can count on one hand how many of my male clients that I know of that were sexually abused as children. I know that number is inaccurate. Boys are sexually abused at almost the same rates as girls. Men are sexually assaulted at almost the same rates as women. Men suffer domestic violence at around the same rates as women. We just don't talk about it. Guys in general don't talk about it. They don't tell anyone. And despite what I would like, I know my clients aren't 100% honest with me for a variety of reasons. And so I know that some of my clients are dealing with trauma, dealing with PTSD, and I kind of can't help them because I don't know that they have it. And for me to push the issue could actually cause more problems than not, and so I don't usually go there. And so that's also a hard part. So with PTSD, what does this all mean for writers? And there's a variety of ways of going about it. One is to just not go about it, as I kind of talked about with my Saga of the Scout. Ethan, the main character, has gone through lots of traumatic events. I just don't go there because that's not the sort of story I want to tell. Maybe I will eventually, but for the most part, I don't really let the action slow down enough to really make him do that. And I actually am intentionally not letting him experience the trauma because I'm going somewhere with it. There's a method to my madness. Look at Memories in the City. The main character is a guy who survived a war. He was a prisoner of war. He was tortured, and when he came home, the city was destroyed and his family was dead. I'm not really giving much away. That's sort of the first few chapters of the book. And so his is very much about PTSD, but I don't tell my readers. This goes back to show, don't tell. I don't tell them he has PTSD. I show them that he has PTSD, and I show them by giving him some of these sort of symptoms. And I think that's, if you want to have a character that is suffering from trauma, that's what you do, is learn about the symptoms of PTSD and see which ones kind of fit in with your character arc. And then again, PTSD is an anxiety disorder, or it's used to be in the same group as anxiety disorders. I think they should have left it alone. So a really amazing character arc for your story is to have your main character come in with some sort of trauma, sort of like Jake Fox from Memories in the City. The story starts and the trauma's already happened. It's revealed as the story goes around. And then have the character arc go through to where he kind of overcomes his PTSD, and how that happens is a variety of different ways. I will say that a more realistic, although not quite as dramatic, is this sort of slow incremental movement towards health, because that's what really most people do. TVs, movies, some books, they all like to have the big scene, the big dramatic scene where the character breaks down and cries and he realizes it wasn't all his fault. There's a great scene from Good Will Hunting that is basically that. In that scene, it kind of worked because Robin Williams, the psychiatrist, was moving Matt Damon's character into that direction. So when he finally did have the big breakdown, it kind of worked. And I have seen that sometimes in my office, but it is by no means necessary. Most clients and most characters really should have this sort of slow progression to where before you realize it, they've changed. A lot of my clients, I have to point out to them how they're getting better because they don't even notice it. I have to point when they say like, "Oh, I'm nothing seems to be working. I'm not getting any better. This was a horrible setback." And I'm like, "No. Imagine how you were, a few months ago or even a few weeks ago in some cases. how would you have handled it back then? You know, I have to remind them that, no, they're making good progress. It's just this slow incremental change, which in a novel is great because you have that space, you have that length that you can do that with. In a short story, yeah, maybe you need the Goodwill Hunting scene, you need the crying part and the big breakthrough. But in a novel, no, you can just kind of make it almost like every chapter or every few chapters, put in a little something that shows the character is getting better in some ways. But they always have to be pushing their boundaries. They have to be always pushing out of their comfort zone because that is inevitably, I don't know if I've said this in other videos, but that's inevitably where change happens. Change and growth happens when you're uncomfortable. And so the character has to be doing something. But again, that's great storytelling, right? You want, internal conflict and external conflict. And so the internal conflict is this character is doing things they don't really want to do, that they feel uncomfortable doing, and then they reach through it. And that arc works in everything. It can work in an action adventure story where a former war veteran has to, get out there and drive a car long distance to save the woman he loves or whatever, and he's pushing on that boundary, that fear of driving or whatever. Romance. This is very common in romance. I would love to see. I don't know. This is me personally, but I'd almost like to see a dark romance where the main character falls in love with a abusive guy, because that seems to be the thing with dark romance. And then like the next book is her recovering from the abusive relationship, and then it's her overcoming her PTSD from that abuse and falling in love with a nice guy. Wouldn't that be nice? But yeah, that's another form of PTSD. People have been in bad relationships, abusive relationships, childhood stuff, of course. And it doesn't even have to be, again, the biggies. It can just be emotional abuse. Most of my clients, that's usually what they're dealing with, is a lot of verbal and emotional abuse as children. And then as they get older, they still have some of this PTSD. I'd almost put lowercase letters, PTSD, of the abuse, as they don't know if they can trust people anymore. They don't know if when the guy they're on a date says they look pretty, they don't know, is he being honest or does he just want something from me? That sort of thing. That's also a form of PTSD. And in order to overcome it, people have to push themselves out of their comfort zone. A lot of us get comfortable in our discomfort. And so my job as a client, as a clinician, is to push them out of that uncomfortable comfort zone into a actual comfortable comfort zone where things are healthy and good and that sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, I think that's about all I've got. PTSD is a very complex. Again, this is one of those topics. You can do a whole series, a whole channel on trauma and PTSD and how to recover. In fact, I'm sure if you look on YouTube, a lot of people already have those channels. But yeah, let me know. What do you think? Do your characters have PTSD? Do you? Well, no, don't tell me if you have PTSD. You don't need to out yourself. But do you think this is an interesting arc character concept sort of thing? Also, let me know any other topics you'd like for me to discuss. Mental health related, that sort of thing. And I will see you later. Bye.